Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening. My name is Chloe McKee and I work in the Beef and Land team at AHDB. Tonight we'll be discussing the recommended grass and clover list, where the data comes from and how to get the most out of it when making reseeding decisions on your farm. The plan of action is that I'll run through the housekeeping, introduce our speakers, and then we'll kick off with a poll, followed by short presentations from our panel before going into the Q&A discussion. As usual, you will all be muted throughout the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question, then please type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see the questions box, please click on the orange arrow to open up the control panel. Click on the questions drop-down and you'll see where you can type your question in. If you're joining us through a mobile or tablet, your questions box will be at the bottom of the screen with a question mark icon. You can type your questions in at any time throughout the webinar, and please use this box to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, and my colleague Sue in the background will do her best to help. The usual advice is to log out and come back in. We have 3 speakers on our panel this evening. Ellie Sweetman is NIAB's Forage Crop Specialist, overseeing national statutory and commercial forage trials programmes and wider project work, of which one is the RGCL. Her background is in livestock, mixed farming and industry, business and technical analysis, agri-environment, resource management and agricultural education, management and governance. We also have Chris Duller, an independent consultant specialising in delivering soil and grassland management advice across all of the livestock sectors. He has a thorough knowledge of soils, nutrient management and managing grazing systems and forage crops. And finally, Nick Morris. Nick is an ex-dairy farmer, now farming beef and arable in Cheshire with 83 hectares of land. And Nick uses a cut and carry system on the beef cattle from March to November. So to kick us off, we'll start with our poll for this evening. And we'd like to know if you currently use the recommended grass and clover list to inform your variety and mixture choices for reseeding, please. So hopefully that should be on your screen now. And the options are yes, I check that the seed I sow is of recommended grass and clover list varieties. Yes, my advisor checks that the seed I sow is on the list. Or your merchant checks that the seed you sow is on the list. Yes, a combination of the answers above. Or no, you don't use the recommended grass and clover list to influence your reseeding choices. Thanks everyone, I can see the votes coming in now. I'll just give you a couple more seconds. Oh, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So 50% of our audience tonight check that the seed they sow is on the recommended grass and clover list variety list, followed by a combination of the 3 answers, and jointly in place with that don't use the recommended grass and clover list at 17%, and then at 8%, they use an advisor or merchant checks the seeds. So that's great that majority of you tonight are using the list and find that useful. Thanks, everyone, for putting your answers in. And we'll go back to the presentation. Thanks, Sue. I think we're ready to hand over to Ellie.
Lovely, thank you very much. Thanks, Chloe. Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you this evening. So I look after the recommended grass and clover list trials programme, and we have various sites and meetings all throughout the year. So if I start by showing you a clip of some of our plots at Headley. Thank you, Sian, if you can move on, please. Is there a handle to find? Do I have control? No.
Apologies, everyone. I think Sue might be having some connection problems.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Okay, thank you very much. So we have trial sites across a large part of the UK in the major grass growing areas. So we have both North and East Scotland as well as Northern Ireland that are predominantly used for the national listing, but that information does carry through to the recommended listing trials work as well, as the varieties get further down the system. Then the main site for NIAB is in North Yorkshire, then there's the IBERS site in Wales, and then in Gloucestershire there's either DLF or DSV have a site. So various different trial operators that contribute, and there's then some best practice working between those through the BSPB trial operators meetings. So we've got lots of good brains involved. And then disease trials run in both Devon and Worcestershire, where the disease isn't necessarily encouraged, but it's in good opportunities for disease to take hold, and they get a real test of varieties and their resistance levels. Thank you. So the assessments that happen throughout the lifespan of these varieties in trials includes two systems. One is through simulated grazing management and one is through conservation management. In order to be efficient, these are both used within the 3-year cycle of one variety's 3 harvest years after it's been sown. We're also measuring digestibility value, of course, D-value and quality, very important. So ME, and for clover is crude protein as well. Brown matter yield is predominantly the information that most folks seem to be interested in, but as well as that we have seasonal growth. So that's from early spring right through to autumn, and also for some of the species it's monthly cuts. Ground cover on a number of occasions just to see how that variety is progressing through its 3 years of harvest. It's no good to get all the bulk in the first year and then it to peter out later on. Winter hardiness assessments are taken first thing in the early spring just to see how the varieties are coping with the conditions. And then of course disease resistance is at all the trial sites, but as well specifically at the 2 disease sites. The trials are then managed according to good farming practice on the whole. So the fertilisers follow best local practice in particular, so within the RB 209 sort of guidelines as well. I am the project coordinator, so if there's anything that somebody wants to use, say a particular herbicide or a particular adjustment to nutrient management, they will come to me initially. If it's something within my remit to answer, I can do so, make that decision. Or if it's beyond that, then it goes to the project board or the crop committees in order for them to get an overall decision, because of course this can impact the whole programme and the data and the fairness of the treatment of the varieties across the board for all the breeders. The project board is made up of a group of different people coming from different perspectives, so it ensures a good, fair assessment of the diseases when the data comes together and is reviewed annually, and the decisions are made. So we also have the Animal and Plant Health Agency do some inspections of sites and oversee the national listing side of the programme, which I'll go on to explain a bit more about. Thank you. So the timeline. Now, the decisions committee for the recommended list, to be produced, such as this year, they are made of a committee of farmers, breeders, and independents. So that can be advisors and other people from industry. To start with, the candidate varieties that are very new, they've been developed by breeders, but they haven't been released into the big wide world. They need to come through first for national listing. And they have to be on the national list in order to be sold in the UK. It used to be, as an alternative, they could be on another European country's national list, grouped under the banner of common catalogue. But now we're out of the EU, that no longer applies. So all the varieties have to come and be judged under UK growing conditions and assessed by the National List Species Committee to see that they are able to be sold in the UK. They're both distinct, uniform and stable varieties, and they also have value for cultivation and use. So that has to happen behind the scenes before the recommended list work happens. But the data that's used to generate that national list data for decisions that data is also carried forward into the recommended list data, and those varieties and plots are grown within the same trials as a recommended list. So the plots you can see before you, on the left you have the early varieties, and they are both recommended list and national listing varieties all mingled in together, grown under the same conditions. So, oh, sorry, back a sec. Suzanne, sorry. Please. Thank you. Sorry, I babbled on a little bit there. So we have all the sites, or 6 sites that are used for the national listing, but then that information continues on to the other sites that are for recommended listing as well. And we have those a few sites that are just recommended listing, don't include all the national listing sowing. So then once we've got all the data from the national list, they go forward as a candidate, and they go forward for a decision making as to whether they're good enough to go on the national list, and they have to bring an overall improvement compared to the average of the list in order to come on in the first place. So after at least 12 years or so of breeding and development, 6 years worth of data under national listing, they still have to prove that they're well above the mean in order to be allowed on the list at all. So a lot of work has to happen before they get that far. Thank you, Suzanne. And then to stay on the recommended list, they get 5 years after they've been first given that provisional status. So PG, provisional general, and PS, provisional, I mustn't say special, it's not special, it's specific. So if they're maybe a weaker in an area, but they're really strong in a major area, so therefore they're given an S status. After 5 years of that data, then they get reviewed in a decision meeting again, and in that meeting they have to be better than the mean again, or equal to it will do at that point, in order to get a whole G or S rating and not be provisional anymore. And then once they've got that G or S, reconsidered every 4 years. And so by this stage, they've had 2 sowings under national list. They've got another 2 sowings plus under recommended list. So you're building up the data each year on year and getting more and more reliable data in large matrix over that period. Thank you. Was that me or is that somebody else? I can talk about. Was that my last one?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a really useful insight into how the list has been developed. Chris, I'll move on to you to run through how we can get the most out of the list, please.
Great evening, everybody. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a grass and consultant based out in West Wales, and I've spent the last 20 years nagging at people. And I guess tonight, yeah, I've got to start nagging at those 17% of you said you didn't use the list. I'm a bit nerdy with numbers, and I love it when the list comes out because it's just tables of data. But the beautiful thing about the list is it is genuine independent data, and in a farming industry we don't get a lot of independent data. There's normally somebody's got a slant or an edge to take, whereas the recommended list is genuine, you know, undoctored numbers that can be really, really useful. I say I'm a part-time farmer, grass consultant. My wife was a grass breeder for 20 years. So you can imagine, yeah, the long winter evenings used to fly by with conversations about grass. Okay, next slide, Suzanne. Just before I start, I thought we'd just look at the value of reseeding as against the cost of reseeding. Do your own cost, but it's somewhere around about £250 an acre to do a full conventional reseed. We need to get it right. But my seed cost is less than 25% of that total cost. I would say straight away, don't get hung up on trying to save money when it comes to buying seed by taking cheaper seed mixtures with maybe varieties that aren't on the list anymore. They might, as Ellie said, might be on a French list or a German list. You know, we need to know that they're decent, they've been tested, and they perform in UK conditions. With that value of £250 an acre, a decent reseed done properly, I can recover all that cost in its first 12 months. Okay, next one, please. So tonight we're going to get all into varieties. All I'll say is at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what varieties we've got. I can muck it up with a poor seedbed preparation and how I manage early establishment and that early management phase. So it is part of the process. The right type of mixture is just as important as variety choice. So variety choice is very much, yeah, putting the icing on the cake and the fine tuning. Okay, thanks. Okay, busy slide, lots on it. Basically, when we start thinking about reseeding, we just want to be sure we know what we want to achieve. The more information you can go with to your seed merchant will help you develop a lay that suits your system. So you want to be just clear in your mind about what you want the lay to do, how long you want it to last, recognize any constraints from soil type, location, and then think really hard about what category of grasses you want, how much perennials, whether they're early, intermediates, lates, the balance between the tetraploid and the diploid varieties, which behave in different manners. Think carefully about the heading date range, and then there's all the options about the other things to maybe chuck in the mix as well, just to complicate matters. So your clover choices, alternative grasses, and then more recently we've seen a big rise in multi-species mixtures. And then it's really, really important to get the balance of grasses to go with your chicory and your plantain absolutely spot on. Okay, next one. So once I've got what we decide what we want to do with a lay, then we need to think about getting out the list and finding the varieties that would most suit our system. And I can either use the list to go through and pick out the grasses I want and then trying to find the seed mixture with those that are included, or I can find a mixture that's an off-the-shelf mix and then literally just use the list to go through and make sure that all the varieties I'm buying are there and are going to perform the job I want to do. Quite often when we go and buy mixtures, you might not be able to get the grasses you want, and sometimes they'll say, well, I haven't got this one, I can give you a replacement. The list gives me an opportunity just to make sure those replacements are up to scratch and are a good replacement. Okay, next one. So this is just a snapshot of one of the pages in the farmer handbook for one of the categories of ryegrass, and all I've done there is just whiz down. Everything's measured in terms of percentage increase above the average, my control, and 1 or 2% either way doesn't make a lot of odds. But when we start to get grasses that might be 5, 6, 7% higher in certain traits, I get my big highlighter pen out and I start crossing these off and saying, oh yeah, those are the ones that I'm going to be looking for when I come to do my shopping for a seed mix. Now, even with Abergain as very good energy and yield figures, there are other varieties on that list that might have better qualities in other things such as ground cover. And I'd be interested to know from the audience about what you look for when you're scanning down the list. Some people, it's all about energy and quality. For me, I'm certainly interested in ground cover, and which gives us a measure of persistence. Okay, next one. So yeah, here's me and my marker pen, and I'm just going through and pulling out the varieties that stand out as the good yielders, the high quality ones, the ones with good ground cover. This is a grab from the merchants list, which contains a whole wealth of information. Both of the lists, the formats are available on the website, and you can download them all straight from the AHDB website. The merchants list is the real nerdy one for people like me who love their numbers, and it breaks down all the categories into things like seasonality growth. So I've just highlighted there at the bottom a couple of grasses that have got really strong early season growth. So if you're an early turnout farm, they're really worth having. Quite often you might pay a penalty for later growth in the season, but for most people it's that spring grass could be a real bonus. If you're on a wet farm and you haven't got an early turnout, then they probably wouldn't be the grasses for you, and you might be able to select others who've got a slightly later growth profile. Okay, next one through. As always, there's a red pen to go in my green pen, and the red pen is literally just pulling out those grasses that might have some slight issues that might not suit my farm. If you're up north, maybe disease might not be much of an issue. If you're down in Cornwall in the southwest, then crown rust and dresser resistance might be more of interest to you. Again, it's not saying don't use the varieties, but you might only want to put them in at 1 kilo or 2 in a mix rather than maybe 4 or 5. Okay, next one. So that whole business of seed mixture balance and variety choice is part of it. And those are all my issues about successful reseeding, what I've got to think about. So it doesn't stop by just going, buying a bag and thinking, right, I've got the best varieties, how can I fail? Again, I'd be interested to know what you guys think is the blueprint for the perfect reseed, but there's an awful lot to consider. Okay, next one. So just my horror stories. Nobody ever takes me to see their lovely new reseed. I always get dragged out to look at the disasters. So this guy didn't bother with soil test. pH is well below where it should be. Phosphates are on the floor now, we find out. Poor consolidation, late going in. And guess what? Yeah, the thistles have arrived big time. Great clover take. He's really reluctant to spray, but in reality, he's now going to have a very gappy open lay. Next one. Okay, this guy, it started to rain. They didn't roll these couple of strips, and you can see the impact it had on plant establishment. So I've got a very gappy sward, poor tillering, lots of meadowgrass, and that is literally by him leaving it late and not looking at weather forecast. Okay, next one. Yeah, last year's reseed. And okay, proper mole infestation, but it is those sort of attention to detail. If he got the mole man in at the early stage, we could have at least reduced some of this damage. And it's going to be a patch-up job just to try and sort this out. Okay, last disaster picture. Okay, it's not just a Welsh thing. It might be, but they're very keen on putting a quarter of a pound or half a pound of rape in their autumn reseed. And then I get taken along to look at what's left the following spring, and invariably it's open and it's gappy and the meadowgrass is coming in, and you think, well, really, was it worth it? So we just got to be careful in that real early phase of establishment that we just give it the tender love and care that a reseed deserves. Okay, thank you. So yeah, this is my blueprint. Do your planning, address your soil issues, sort out your weeds before you start. Talk to your merchants, look at the list, make sure you've got the right type of seed mix, and make sure you're using the right method. Nick's going to talk about minimum till and drilling and everything else. Sometimes the plough is the best bit of kit. If I can avoid it, I will. And then we've got to think about how we just look after it in those first few months. Okay, that'll do.
Thanks very much, Chris. We'll move on to Nick now, and Nick gives an insight into your farming system and how you use the list to make decisions, please.
Good evening. We rear beef cattle for a company, and we take them through to just before finishing. We have them at 6 months old, and we take them through to about 22 months old. We feed zero graze grass from as early as we can to as late as we can, as we can travel. Main grasses are perennial ryegrasses, but we have been trying some hybrids and some festuliums. When we're choosing the ryegrasses, my first consideration is how much energy is the grass going to give me, because energy is the driving factor, is what grows me cattle, and that's paramount for me. Secondly, I will look at how long it's going to last, whether it needs to be tetraploid or diploid, depending on what I want to do with it. Whether I want to, I'm cutting mainly every 30 days or 25 to 30 days. That grass is what we've cut this time. It's a second cutting. We got ahead of us because we couldn't start too early. Normally we would like to cut it about six inches. That's about 12 to 15 inches high, and that's an Italian, and it's put in an arable rotation. That is, so that was put in because we didn't get all the seed in 2019, and what we did get in was a disaster. So we ended up doing a patch job with iron box in the spring of 2020, and that's the result of it. We've used conventional for a long while, trying to use less conventional now for reseeding. We're using direct ironbocking and a no-till drill. We've both used both of them successfully. The no ironbocking we've done on a grazing field where we tipped some suckler cows. We cut it and then we drilled it and let the cows on it all the while until it started showing, and then we fastened them off it, and that was really successful. So yeah, that's about it really. We keep grazing, grazing for as long as we can, and the grasses that we chose, I also like to make sure that the winter hardy and that the grasses are there for, you know, a while. So I tend to look at what percentage is still there after the 3rd year for persistency. Because it's not, like as the guy before said, it's not a cheap exercise, so it's worth doing well. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions to follow. Before we move on, I'd just like to highlight that those of you that are signed up to receive our Beef and Lamb Ruminant News magazine or the All Things Dairy magazine through the post, you will receive a copy of the recommended Grass and Clover List handbook this summer with the magazine. And in the meantime, the handbooks and Merchant's Guide can be accessed online. So we have a few questions in already. So the first one is, how can we use the recommended Grass and Clover List to help improve organic matter percentage and soil health, as well as mixed species? Can I come to you first, Chris, please?
Oh, thank you. Okay, so it's not something we're going to be measuring. All we measure in terms of grass assessments are the above ground traits, but you have to remember that invariably your below ground root activity matches what we grow above ground, so there's a direct relationship with yield. When we come into looking at mixed swards, so we know there's complementary root growth, so they go at different layers in the soil profile. So if I'm mixing my ryegrass and my timothies and my festuliums, then I'm going to increase that rooting profile. And whilst we're chasing organic matter, why wouldn't you have the likes of red clover with a big taproot as well? So I think it's those are the ways that, you know, basically we're looking for the high yields and the range of rooting depths would be my take on that.
Thanks, Chris. Ellie or Nick, do you have anything to add?
If you're doing a arable rotation, there's certainly got to be room for putting green mulch in and putting either a spring reseed or a spring sown barley crop in. That we're looking at that this time.
Thanks, Nick. The next question, Ellie, is for you. Can I use the list to work out the megajoules per kilo of DM of a seed mixture to compare one mixture to another? I think you're on mute, Ellie.
Sorry. Yes, my MEU is on there, so it has as a fashion. But of course, how that plant grows and behaves in your own circumstances depends on how you manage it. So you're better off to look at the resultant sward rather than relying on what you can calculate from the book data.
Thanks, Ellie. And the next one's for you, Nick. How do you measure the success of the seeds that you have chosen from the list?
Well, with zero graze, so it's quite easy to see how much scraps we're getting off the field. And I know that I've only got a small 8-ton trailer with wide tyres, so we can go travel. So I know I can get, when it's full to busting, we can get about 4 ton of fresh weight on that, of about 20% dry matter. So that's one way. And persistency, yeah, I mean, if it starts getting gappy or, you know, then we start looking into boosting it. We will boost now rather than go for a complete overhaul, especially if we've got no weed grasses or there's no major weed infestation.
Thanks, Nick. And what do you find is the best way of boosting that ley after a few years if you feel it needs a top up?
I will go in for depending on whether I want. I will look in for the seasonality grasses. The amount of grass that they provide during the season, and if I think this field will carry me at the shoulders of the season, then I will look for early spring growth and varieties that will give me early spring growth combined with other varieties, probably later grasses that will boost the yield during the back end, and possibly a festulium as well, because they will grow at lower soil temperatures.
Thanks, Nick. That's really useful. Ellie, the next one is for you. Have you done any research on herbs, please?
Hello, not as part of the recommended grass and clover list system. We have got some other foraging project work going on underway at NIAB at the moment. So if anybody wants to drop me an email, I can make sure they're included and we get their involvement in that project.
Thanks, Ellie. Chris, I'll start with you for this one. Are the drought-resistant properties of Festilolium grass varieties worth prioritising for a farm in the east with reduced rainfall rather than a late PRG?
There's no doubt that some of them have a good drought tolerance. Again, as part of all the monitoring programme and the variety trial sites, we've got several that are under severe drought restrictions. So you head up to Headley Hall in most years, and they're under some sort of drought stress. So they've been tested, and yeah, we know that we can get some boosts. The tetraploids generally tend to have a little bit more drought tolerance, but yeah, certainly I would rather go for a Festilolium above something like Coxfoot. I think they're slightly easier to manage, but other people will probably have opinions on that. But yeah, it's not something we're measuring at the minute, and it's quite a difficult one when we start looking at how we actually measure roots. It's hard enough work measuring leaf, let alone trying to measure roots.
Thank you. And if you were looking to include a white clover in the ley going forward, how can you use the list to make sure you pick the best variety?
Well, there are white clover varieties are included in the grass and clover list, and the white clovers are all grown on the trials programme with companion grass as well to be more representative.
Yeah, so it's all about picking the right leaf size. So if you look through the list, they're across the table, we have increasing leaf size. The larger the leaf, generally the less tolerant they are of hard grazing. So we need to think not just about what you're grazing most of the year, but certainly for some of the dairy boys, we've got to think about, well, if you've got sheep coming in over winter, maybe the real big stuff might not survive. And ditto, if you're doing long silage cuts or running heavy covers, then the smaller leaf might not be the best way. So you need to pick whatever leaf size suits your system.
In the Merchant's Guide, a bit more data on the clovers. It includes how the clover behaves under hard and light defoliation. So you can see which varieties are standing up best to more sheep-like grazing or more cattle-like grazing. But yes, there is quite a considerable range in leaf size, and the leaf size measurement is included in there as well. So they go from, I think the smallest one around, is it 400 or 600 millimeters squared over a leaf up until about 1500. So there is a real variation.
I mean, most merchants will sell you a blend that includes a bit of a spread of leaf size just to cover your bases a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, thanks both. Thank you for explaining that one. Ellie, the next one is for you. In your trials, do you look at all the varieties in the world, or is it restricted to particular seed houses?
It's not restricted, but the breeders have to submit their varieties into the trial system, and they pay for the varieties that come in for it. So they all have to be on the national list, and it's in the interest of the breeders to put their varieties in a good chance of getting above the mean if they can on that list, because obviously it will be a more saleable variety for them. So there are a range of different breeders. Some have quite a lot in, some smaller breeders maybe only have a few. Some who have most of their sales in other European countries sort of will still keep a handle here, and others have a bigger market. So it is quite variable, but there are a good range of different breeders, and they have the opportunity to be involved in overseeing the programme.
Thanks, Ellie. And what difference does it make silaging a brand new ley versus an old ley, or one that has been on the list for several years? Is there a large notable difference in yield?
Yes, there generally would be. There's been progress year on year in the years produced for the varieties on the list, and bearing in mind that's at the same nutrient input year on year. So you're getting not only more yield, high yielding varieties, but they're also doing so with the same or less inputs. So it is important to try and use the list of varieties. They're going to be more efficient. Financially, yes, reseeding is a big cost, but it is worth the investment if it means you're going to get better return on your investment, higher yielding, potentially better quality.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Last year we've got 2 fields that we regularly silage, and I thought that they've been in 15 years, mainly cut, and they were all leading grasses at the time. They're both yielding, or appear to be yielding okay, but I thought, well, about time we give them a boost. So we ironboxed one field in after 3rd cut last year, and rolled it in, and we've just cut it. And certainly from a visual point of view, the field was a lot more even. There was more, the swaths were larger than the other field, so we will do the other field again this year.
One thing that's also important to bear in mind is that when you've got a well-developed, established soil that's got a really good root system, it's going to be able to make much more use of the resources that are there in the soil and cycling through the soil than something that is newly sown. So it is really important how you manage that, how you cut it, and when, how much time you give it to regenerate, for the root and stem reserves to refill, send new leaves out, capture that sunlight energy again before you go on too early for grazing. It all can make a difference with the productivity.
Thank you both. And Nick, how long are you leaving your leys in for before you plan a reseed?
Well, that's how long's a piece of string. On the arable, we've got a bit of an arable rotation, and we will put a 3 or 4 year one in, mainly Italians and tetraploids. They're just for cutting, and on the more permanent ones, we tend to just, as I've said before, leave them until we think that they're not performing, or they're becoming gappy. When and it's when you're zero grazing, you can it's more obvious. It's easier to see than just a set stocking system.
I think it's the beauty for those that are measuring grass is you can get a real good handle on when your leys stop performing. And this spring was a great time for identifying the leys that are struggling. It's the older ones that didn't cope with the cold and the wet. The newer leys did really bounce forward. So yeah, that's the more measurement we can do on farm, the better.
Thanks, Chris. And the next question is for you. Do you recommend staying with PRG tetraploids for overseeding, or other grasses like fescues or timothy?
Again, it depends what I'm overseeding into. So if Nick's going to top up his silage leys, then my options are the hybrids, the tetraploids, and festulomes. Nice big seed. I've got plenty of space. But if I've got a long-term grazing layer that I want to top up, then they're probably not the best. It's quite hard because the diploids are a smaller seed. They're a little bit slower to come. They're less aggressive. We just need to be a little bit more careful with TLC if we're going to try and get those. Quite often I'll put in a standard seed mix that's got a bit of tetraploid as well as the diploids, and try and get a bit of everything in there. And I say it's just about trying to prevent everything out competing those slower to establish grasses. I mean, we've played around over sowing things like Timothy and the like. Small seeds just take a long time to come through.
Thanks, Chris. And Ellie, as a grass plant matures, would the sugar content fall? So year 2 versus 10?
Oh, golly, well, we don't continue to. You're talking about a plant that's been established for a 10-year period. We don't measure that under the recommended list system. They have 3 harvest years. They will be resown again, but it's not the same plant that's lasted 10 years. So generally speaking, the plants do reduce in their productivity over longer periods of time. And so as the plant matures, it's more about its maturity throughout the season rather than year on year, because you're getting that new growth each year where that you're harvesting rather than old bits of plant that's staying there. But the ability for those growing points to produce new shoots effectively and efficiently can reduce over time, but of course you have the advantage of having a more developed root structure as well.
Yeah, if you look on the list, it gives you the year when the particular variety was first introduced, and there's some of the older ones that are still there on good recommendations, but when you compare them to the new kids on the block, that there is a big difference. You know, you're talking about 4 or 5% difference at least on some of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. And Nick, how are you using nitrogen fertilizer? We've got a question here. Do the varieties perform the same at lower N applications?
Right. As I say, we tend to go around monthly, so we're putting about 40 kilos of nitrogen on every month.
Okay. Yeah.
And we've got, and also we'll chase the zero graze around with a slurry tanker. It's not slurry, it's mainly dirty. It's dirty water plus is probably the best way of describing it. And that certainly does make a difference if we sort of getting a bit short of water in the soil.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the nitrogen regimes. I think with where we sit with plant breeding, in that, all right, we apply 300 odd K of nitrogen to the trial plots, but in reality there is no organic nitrogen coming in the system on a breeder's plot. You know, we haven't had a grazing animal there. Organic matter levels are quite low, and all we're doing is mirroring what Nick would be doing with about 150 Ks plus manure and turnover like that. So it's you know, it's a good indication for a lot of people, and we've done trials in the past looking at if we take nitrogen right back, and the ranking of varieties is very, very similar. So they function equally as well at high and low N regimes.
Yeah, and that is an important point in that looking at the data on the list and the varieties there, it's all about the ranking rather than true data in that sense. So the measures that are given on there are how a variety compares with the mean of that group, not about the variety's own data specifically with how many kilos or tons a hectare you can achieve with that particular variety. So it is relative, and as Chris says, previous studies have been done under low nitrogen conditions and found that those ranks, you know, or it ranked the same. Yeah.
Thanks both, that's a really useful tip. And are the grass mixtures tested for germination like arable crops? How do we know we've got good germination?
Yes, the seed that comes in, new varieties or varieties that are coming from further afield do go for germination testing, just to make sure that we have good quality seed going to trial. And then, of course, the germination is measured by the trial operators as part of their assessment.
Thank you, Ellie. We just have a couple of questions left, in case any more sneak in the next few minutes. Do we have any information on resistance to salt from winter gales?
Not within the data that we use for the recommended list. That's not to say there isn't some out there somewhere.
Thank you.
No. And again, this point is your farm is one big experiment. So there's plenty of opportunity. You can go and buy a straight variety and do a small piece, do a strip with a variety. How does it stand up? Does it suit my farm? You know, we need to encourage people to be brave, go and have a play. You know, I say most seed merchants will be able to provide you with small amounts of straights of a lot of varieties, and you can do your own trials on farm and find out what suits your system and what really doesn't like the salt.
Thanks both. And Ellie, what are the highlights of the new varieties this year, please?
Oh, now you're testing me. So we've got some good varieties coming through that includes Aberroot, which is an intermediate Festilolium. That's got excellent D value under simulated grazing and really good high spring growth as well as good ME yield. We've got Weatherby, a late perennial that's got an excellent grazing yield under both grazing and conservation. It's also got good resistance to crown rust. So we've also got Pinaco, an Italian ryegrass, got good yields in both harvest years, excellent second conservation cut yield in the first harvest year and under the monthly cut regime. And so there are, I think we've got 9 new varieties that have come to the list this year, and we have a large number more candidates than that, so they don't all get through, but those are the ones that have got through. So we'll be collecting more data that will inform the lists as those varieties stay in the system over the next few years. There should be some summaries about the main benefits of each of the new varieties included in the back of the booklet, I believe, that you have for the new RGCL this year. There are other ones that obviously I haven't mentioned.
I think one of the biggest changes I've seen sitting on the committee is how much more focused the breeders are on disease resistance, and the scores seem to be really ranking up now. So yeah, there's a lot of effort gone in as disease issues become more prevalent, that the breeders have really responded well.
Thank you, Chris. And just on that subject, as we think into the future, do we know what's coming up in the future regarding grass breeding and genetics tools?
Well, I think, you know, hot topics everybody's aware of it is about reducing nutrient inputs, reducing nitrous oxide emissions, reducing carbon, reducing methane. So there's a really broad scale of work across the industry that will relate to that. You know, improved or reducing methane output basically requires you to have increased efficiency, food conversion efficiency. So there you need your good sugars in your grass to balance with your protein for your microbial activity. And you want to get good efficient conversion of the inputs into the grass growth yield. So that means putting your nutrient on at the right time where you possibly can, in the right conditions, and just growing the grass as a crop, feeding that plant as required to get the best you can out of it.
Thanks, Ellie. So some exciting things to come. And
yeah,
Nick, have you?
Sorry, things like the Festuloliums, you know, we're very early days in a lot of those hybrids. There's an awful lot in the system that can come through, and we'll have more options to do with Festuloliums for grazing lays as much as silage lays. So that's going to be a huge area of interest.
There is a lot more interest as well at present with the last few years we've had with grasses that cope better with drier conditions, colder springs, etc. But of course, bear in mind that it takes a good 10, 12 years plus for the breeders to do their development work for them to get to the stage that they can start coming in the trial system. So, and the breeders are understandably going to not be widely sharing all their thoughts and development plans too early on in the process.
Yes, last spring we put in Italian plus and Festolian mix in. It was sown on the 25th of April and it didn't have any rain or moisture for it for probably a month or more. It's been remarkable the amount of cover that we've got on it. And this spring the field was just waterlogged in patches and it didn't seem to affect it. We've just taken the sides, cut the cells off it and been really pleased with it. So that's me just playing with bits of stuff.
There's one thing to bear in mind with Festolonians, the hybrid with fescues and ryegrass, is that they can be torn fescues or meadow fescues. They can be perennial ryegrass, potentially or Italians, and the proportion of the parentage in there is quite variable as well. So until we get more Festolonians coming through the system, it's quite difficult to categorize them as one particular thing, because they do have quite a lot of genetic variety there. So speak to merchants, breeders, advisors to work out, if you do want to go for a Festolonian, just what's the most suitable parental stock, if you like, for your system.
Thank you, Ellie. We've just got a couple more questions left. Nick, are you using the list to select clover varieties for your farm?
Yes, I have done in the past. We've got a bit of an issue. We've had an issue with dock. We're using red clover in the cutting lays and also for zero grazing. It seemed to work really well. And then we had an issue with dock, so I've sacrificed the clovers at the minute. I am looking again at them for stitching in. And I will be using something along the mid table, something violin, Dublin, something like that, something that's going to give me a happy medium.
Thanks, Nick. And is there any extra info, Nick, that you would like to see on the recommended list?
Oh heck.
Or does it give you everything you need, do you think?
Yeah, I think is there any room for? I mean, you do protein content in your clovers. Is there any room for protein content in your ryegrasses? I'll chuck that back.
Well done in previous years, and I have to say not in the recent years, has shown not very significant differences in the protein levels between the different varieties at that point. And it is something that could be included back in, but the thing to bear in mind is now that the recommended list is mostly funded by the breeders, every extra assessment that we need to do will add to their cost. And may encourage them or otherwise to include more varieties in there. But it is something, as Chris will say as well from being on the panels, that it's something that's always is under review. So there are a number of meetings each year and year on year, and as the varieties develop, these things come back around and get discussed again that maybe haven't been talked about for the last couple of years. So the people that are on those panels collectively are always thinking about what's the best thing to do with the list for developing it going forward.
Okay.
Thank you both. And last question for this evening, does the list have a date of when first on the list so you can see how old the variety is, please?
Yes, it does. It's surprising how old some of them are on there. There's some from 80s and beyond. So, yeah. But if they're on the list still, it's because they're holding their own amongst the other varieties and the new up-and-coming varieties. It may well be there's particular traits that they're really strong in, and it may be that breeding has changed over the years to look at other traits slightly more, perhaps, but they do have to hold their own overall in order to remain on the list.
Thanks, Ellie, that's brilliant. Thank you, Nick, Chris, and Ellie, for your time this evening and answering all of those questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone at home for listening. The presentation and questions have been recorded and they'll be available on the Beef and Lamb and Dairy YouTube channels. So thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, and please get in touch if you have any further questions. Thank you. Bye.
Right.